Hello, and welcome to the first lecture segment in your real estate course. Each of these segments will be highlights of the chapter of the reading material for the course. I'll try to focus on the things that I believe are important, and there's a much richer body of material in the textbook, but when it comes to deciding, for example, for review at the end of the course, what is important? Well, what we cover here is what Professor Archer thinks is important, so that's what you'll want to pay attention to, and hopefully this will help you focus through using the slides. So our first topic is one that's really fundamental to real estate. In fact, many people think it is real estate, and that's property and property concepts. So there's lots to be looked at there, and let's jump in. So what's this? You'll probably recognize this as a sticker for a window sticker for a car. So the question is, why can't we simply have something like this to take care of the information that a buyer needs when they're looking at real estate? This is a very efficient kind of device. What we're going to show in several lectures here, however, is the bad news that it probably is never going to work. In fact, I would assert it's never going to work. Real estate is just too complicated in too many ways, and in fact so much so that what we find as we go into this story is that there are even whole institutions as well as whole contract forms and procedures that have had to evolve for real property because it is such a complicated kind of thing. And so that's what we're going to start looking at. So let's step in first with the notion of property. And so we like to think about, it's very instructive, I think, to think about real property as a bundle of rights. So what does that mean? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what are property rights and what is real property. We'll also talk about what is, let me get my little cheater here. What is personal property, and what do we do when the difference is unclear? And unfortunately, there's a lot of times when that's the case, so we want to look at that. Okay, and finally, what variations are there in this bundle that we call real property? And what we're going to see is lots and lots of them. Okay, so here's a kind of a picture that is of various properties, these lovely little houses here. They all look pretty much the same when you look closely, and yet I would argue that they can be quite different from each other because the property rights, the bundle of property that the owner has can vary a lot from one of these to another. The kinds of things we'll see that are different. If you're in the city versus the county, that has some limits or can place different limits on the bundle of rights that you really enjoy. There will be something called implied easements in some of these properties, and we'll go back and look at those a little bit later. There can be prescriptive easements even, and we have an example that kind of suggests that in one of these properties. And easements in gross, whatever that is, and our agenda is that we're going to find out what those are. And there are marital rights that can differ from one of these properties to another, automatic claims of ownership that can differ. And restrictive covenants can intervene and cause variation in these properties. And so we have lots of ways in which that seemingly similar bundle of rights can vary from one property to another in very important ways. So let's start at the top. What are rights? Well, they're claims, for one thing, they're claims that the government is obligated to enforce. And they're derived from the Constitution. They differ from raw power. When I think of this issue, I think of street gangs who sometimes have taken over a territory. And particularly in the darkness of night, they'll claim that territory and attempt to control the activity. But notice the big difference. The government not only is not obligated to enforce their claims, it's obligated to nullify their claims and protect the claims of the citizens who have the right to be there. So one is in this case, the citizens' rights are, the government has an obligation to protect them, and on the other hand, not so with the gang. So another characteristic, though, that is important here is that rights are non-revocable. A private citizen, my neighbor, can't decide I don't have the rights to my property. The government can't even decide that I don't have rights to my property. Now, to be sure, the government can, acting on behalf of other citizens, it can reduce my property rights and does in many ways in the interest, supposedly, we hope, in the interest of the health and safety and welfare of the citizens at large. So yes, they can constrain the rights, but they can't arbitrarily take them or revoke them. A final characteristic of rights that's important to us is they are enduring. And so they are not limited to the memory of owners and others. For example, the place where I stand is on a grant called the Arredondo Grant from the Viceroy of Cuba to Don Arredondo in 1821. So the rights to land in this territory around where I stand now go back at least as far as 1821. And so if I really want to know what the rights are that somebody holds today in this particular region of the map, I have to know, in theory, I have to know what happened to those rights from 1821 down to the present. And we're going to see what that fact does to shape the way we go about the real estate transaction process. Now again, a government or other entity can't simply nullify those rights because they just don't go away. They don't fade out, and they can't be canceled by either private citizens or government. Now, there are different kinds of rights, of course, and we should pay attention to that. There are personal rights and there are property rights. And of course, we're interested in the latter in our course, but we need to make that distinction. So what are personal rights? We'll see the list here in just a moment, but they're freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution to individuals and through the Supreme Court interpretations of that Constitution. I like this diagram to kind of suggest the difference. So on this side, we have personal rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, no unreasonable search or seizure, and on down to a speedy, public, and fair trial. And on the other side, we have property rights. Up at the top, we have what we'll come to call personal property, vehicles, household goods, stocks and bonds, patents, software, music. All of that's part of personal property. But over here then, in this lower area, we have all kinds of different real property, ranging from residences to airports to utilities to streets and railroads and bridges, everything that is permanent. Now, what I like about this diagram is it kind of suggests the reality that sometimes, basically, in many ways, there's a conflict between personal and property rights. And if we expand property rights, they may infringe or tend to lessen personal rights. And an example where that becomes significant regularly is with places like malls, where they're privately owned property and they're businesses, but they have increasingly substituted for the public spaces in our communities. So how much free expression do people have in a mall is an issue that comes up fairly regularly. So far, the mall owners have successfully argued in most cases that they have a right to protect their business enterprises and their merchants. And so if they deem something inappropriate, deem some kind of expression like political campaigning or protest movements, if they deem those inappropriate for the mall, they have the right to cancel them or to prevent them. But the issue is still alive and goes on. So we have this potential conflict between property and personal rights that's part of our society. Okay, again, personal rights versus property rights. What do we mean exactly? What if we take apart this notion of property rights, what's there? So one aspect of it is exclusive possession. So if with your computer or your car or your apartment or your residence, you have the right to keep everybody else that you don't want to welcome. You have the right to keep them from using it and enjoying the benefits. On the other hand, you always have the right to use it yourself normally. Okay, another related aspect or facet of property rights is what we call enjoyment, the right to use or to collect rents or to harvest and retain the fruits of the land. So all these would be what we call the enjoyment of the property, and that's another facet of what we mean. And finally, one that isn't so obvious perhaps, and that is the freedom to dispose as you please. Now you can't blow up your house, of course, because that poses a threat to your neighbors and to other persons. So you infringe on their personal rights, among other things. But generally speaking, within limits of safety, you have the right to stomp on your computer if you can't stand it anymore, or to modify it or dispose of it. And the same with real property. You have the right to modify it or dispose of it or sell it as you choose. So that's the freedom to dispose as one pleases. Okay, so now let's come back to this difference between real property and personal property. Real property is rights in land and its permanent structures. That seems clear enough, doesn't it? That's a nice, simple way of describing it. And here's something that's even simpler. Personal property is everything else. So personal household goods, intellectual property, music, and all the patents and the sorts of things we mentioned earlier. So we sort of have two complementary things here that covers the world. We got real property, rights in land and permanent structures, and personal property, everything else. Well, it would be nice if that were true, but we're going to come back and mess that up in just a moment. Okay, so the real property rights, rights to land and its permanent structures, we should note actually extends beyond just the surface. It's the airspace as high as it's practical to develop things, and with one limit being perhaps in air traffic control zones near airports. And the other, going in the other direction, you have the rights to what's below the earth as far as it's practical to reach for it. So that means you can go down several miles for oil and so forth. Okay, now those airspace rights actually are pretty interesting and pretty significant in many instances. For example, here's the old Pan American building in New York, now the MetLife building, built purely on airspace over the tracks going into Grand Central Station. So the building is set on on some pylons, and there's what we call an easement to maintain those pylons on the ground. But basically the ground space is railroad space, and the and the building lies in the air above those tracks. In Chicago, there's an even bigger space of this. There used to be an old rail yard here, the Illinois Central. Over the decades, it's turned into a fabulously large business and hotel and apartment community. I think it's sometimes called the New East Chicago or something like that. And our Illinois Center is another name attached to it. But basically, all of these buildings have a kind of an interesting character because they're all sort of above the streets and driveways and parking areas that lie beneath them. And you notice in looking at it, you notice there's something different about the way they're constructed. They're sort of suspended over things. And sure enough, basically they're built on air rights. Okay, so let me cloud this distinction between real and personal property now. What would this be? A valuable chandelier? Or what would custom drapes be? Or what would a kitchen and refrigerator be? Or retail cases in a retail store, in a mall, say. Or restaurant booths and other kinds of furnishings in a restaurant. Or a basketball goal attached to a garage. Or a backyard playhouse. Are these real property or are they personal property? And the answer is yes. It depends on the circumstances and sort of the history of that particular item, as a matter of fact. So over the rule, and one of the implications of this that's really important is in almost every real estate transaction, these ambiguous kinds of items can arise. And it's extremely important to figure out before the transaction what's going to be what. Okay, so this is called the problem of fixtures. And a fixture is something that was personal property but has become adapted to real property. So it's real property. So a fixture is real property. And one of the important things about that, as I started to say a moment ago, is that whenever there's a contract to convey real property, as we'll look at in this course, fixtures automatically go with the real property because they are real property. So unless something is explicitly said to the contrary, anything that is deemed a fixture goes with the property. And that can be a matter of confusion, of disappointment, of delay, of litigation, and cost. Okay, so how do courts have faced this problem regularly for generations? So they've evolved ways of trying to deal with it. It's not the best solution to go into a court to settle this by any means, but courts have had to do it frequently. So the chief determinant nowadays, they've had several rules, but the chief determinant nowadays is what's called customary practice. And that doesn't mean, called intention of the parties. And that doesn't mean, what did he plan to do or what did she plan to do? It means what is the customary practice. So, for example, appliances in a house are deemed customarily to be personal property. So the refrigerator and kitchen range, freestanding kitchen range presumably, those will be considered to be owned by the seller in a transaction, and the presumption is the seller takes them with him unless we specify otherwise. On the other hand, the same appliances in an apartment complex will be presumed in most jurisdictions to be part of the real property. They're presumed to be fixtures. Okay, trade fixtures in a business establishment, a restaurant, or a retail store, they are presumed, they don't look very transient, but they're presumed in almost all cases to be property of the tenant. They're presumed to be personal property until such time as the tenant leaves and abandons them. So if even though if you take those out of the store or the restaurant, the place looks like a stripped, barren structure, they're still considered to be part of the tenant's property. Same with farms. If you have a tenant farmer on land, the tenant puts up fences or granaries or other structures, those belong to that tenant until such time as they leave and abandon them. So here's a beautiful retail establishment, and in this case, there are several things here. This looks like a simple case, but this light post, the storefront sign, the pole sign, the display cases inside, the awning, the ice chest, all of these could be either real or personal property. They could be a fixture or they could be personal property. So what do? One of the fundamental things that we have to do with any real estate transaction is to look at the property and put these question marks out here. What is this? Is it going to convey with the property? Is it a fixture, in other words? Or is it a personal item that the seller wishes to retain? And to their credit, many local real estate associations dealing with residential real estate, for example, realize this can be a very significant issue, and they have a checklist. I think our local realtors have something like 120 items on a checklist. And so the idea is that when the house is being put up for sale, they will go through that list and see if there are any items in the house where this issue needs to be addressed. And that's the wise thing to do, to think about this in advance of any transaction and make sure that it's very clear what is to convey with the contract and what won't. Okay, now some terminology and concepts that we need. One of them is an interest in real property. And what is that? It's not, when I ask what is your interest in real property, I'm not asking how excited you are about it. I'm asking what bundle of rights do you hold? And so an interest is any set of rights in real property. And there are variations in that. An estate is a real property interest that includes the right of exclusive possession. Remember that from a few moments ago? And we'll see there are very, very important other kinds of interests that don't have exclusive possession. Right now, let's look at the estates, those that are well, in a moment. Here are the non-possessory interests we'll look at in the next session. We'll look at easements, we'll look at restrictive covenants, and we'll look at liens. And all of these are very complex, quite varied, and very, very important, sort of conflicting or non-possessory interests that can reduce the bundle of rights that an owner retains. Okay, now to the estates. There are basically two classes of estate interests. There are those that are ownership. We call those freeholds in the Old English tradition. And we have leaseholds, which are rental estates. Now, the most complete bundle of rights that an owner can have is the fee simple absolute. That's the whole bundle that's available. That can be reduced in some ways. A couple of important examples would be this. First, the fee simple can turn into a fee simple conditional with a reverter interest. Example, suppose we have a house across from campus, and this is the sort of thing that has happened at many state universities and elsewhere. A faculty member lives adjacent to the university. The university is expanding. The faculty member is retired, but they want to stay in the neighborhood. But they have good feelings toward their school, and they're willing to convey that property to the university for its use at some time in the future, but they want to live there for the rest of their life. And under those circumstances, one arrangement that can be made is to create, and I'm skipping down here one, an ordinary life estate where the owner retains full ownership until their death. And at that time, they will have given, before that, a remainder claim to the university such that their ownership transfers automatically to the university at the time of their death. And that's what we call an ordinary life estate with a remainder interest. Now, in Florida, it's important to know that there is also we can also have something called a legal life estate that's created by state law. And in fact, every family with minor children that owns a home and declares a homestead automatically creates the possibility of a legal life estate. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's in another session. But that turns out to be an important thing for homeowners with children in Florida to realize. Now let me back up here and pick up one other point. So that house near the university. Suppose we have a different scenario where the owner of that house is leaving it and the university wants it, so they agree to convey it to the university, either as selling it or perhaps contributing it to the university, but they put a disclaimer, that is, they put a restriction that they want the house used for student organizations. Okay, fine. So the university takes the house and they set up student organizations, but over the years their needs change, and they decide that the house is best used as an administrative office. Then they are violating the clause or the restriction that the original owner imposed, and at that point, either that owner or the heirs of the owner, if they recognize this and feel strongly about it, they can exercise that restriction, and they can sue to regain the property from the university because they're exercising their reverter interest in the property. So that would be a fee simple conditional with a reverter interest. Okay, so those are the ownership estates that I wanted to mention to suggest the kind of variety that can exist in this thing we call ownership. Now let's turn our attention down here to the two leaseholds, and those are there are two of them that I want to stress. The first one is the tenancy for years, and this is typically will be a leasehold or a lease of more than 1 year. It could be 99 years, and it will be determined by, it will have a very specific date that it ends. As I said, it can be something more than a year. It can be 99 years. Technically, it can be less than a year, but rarely it isn't. It must be in writing due to something we'll refer to several times in our course called the Statute of Frauds. This is an Old English law from 1677 that requires that any conveyance of real estate, real property, be in writing, and an extremely wise and important thing. So this lease has to be in writing if it's more than 1 year, and that lease, that written lease, will govern almost every aspect of the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So that's a tenancy for years. And for example, most business leases will be a tenancy for years. The other kind of lease that's more common is a periodic tenancy. And this is one from month to month, or it can be from year to year. It's much more, it can be much more informal in character. And it has no definite length of time. What happens is the cycle of the lease is determined by how frequently the payment is made, typically month to month. And either party can terminate by giving notice with adequate time prior to the next rental payment. Typically, state laws will require that the notice be given at least 1/2 period ahead of time. Varies a little with the state, exactly how much time must be allowed. But unless either party gives the notice, the lease just keeps rolling over and over for an indefinite period of time. Now, one thing that's unique about this relative to the other leaseholds and other real property interests, this can be conveyed orally. And that's not a very good idea at all, because there are just too many details, particularly in a residential lease, that need to be clarified between the landlord and tenant. But it is possible for this to be an oral agreement. So that's all we'll say about these interests. They're very important, and we need to know they're there. One other thing that is important in this realm, those lease concepts I just talked about are sort of almost medieval in their history. And they grew up in a world of purely agriculture where leasing was very simple. The obligation of the landlord was to get off the land and let the tenant farmer manage the land. And the obligation of the tenant was to pay the rent. And that's about the story. But in a modern urban apartment complex, we've got a different story. Because the tenants in that apartment can't individually fix the roof. They can't individually control rodents or roaches, and they can't individually fix a system heating facility, and so we've got a very different situation in a residential apartment complex. And those old leasehold concepts are very inadequate. They give a very uneven relationship. To coin a new phrase, they have an uneven playing field where the landlords tend to have an advantage. So many states, Florida was one of the early ones, have rewritten that law and introduced what they call a model or a modern residential landlord and tenant act. And that defines much more clearly the obligations of the landlord, the obligations of the tenant, the rights of the landlord, the rights of the tenant, when a landlord can have entry, when a renter can withhold rent, under what cause. And so those kinds of things are spelled out very clearly. And if you go to, for example, all you have to do is Google landlord-tenant law for a particular state, and chances are very good you'll find that law. In Florida, you find something like this. Here you find a summary of the law. And even reading the text of the law itself is really not that bad. It's fairly short, fairly clearly written, and has some pretty interesting information about the rights and responsibilities of both the landlord and the tenant. So you can very quickly find this sort of thing on the web. Okay, so summary of our story then. Rights are enduring claims that the government is obligated to enforce. Property rights include exclusive possession, enjoyment, and right of disposition. Real property is rights in land and its permanent structures. Fixtures are real property that has converted from personal property, so it has become real property. Estates are real property bundles that include that exclusive possession. Okay, so we started out with this picture of that sticker. Are you kind of getting to get the idea that this would be a pretty messy story to put on one page here? And what we're going to do in the lectures ahead is to make it even more challenging, to show that it gets to be pretty much hopeless to be able to describe real property with a single window sticker. So we'll figure out then, we'll see what the problems are, and then try to figure out how to fix them.